Hi everybody. Uh, Welcome to this first in this series of projects. I hope that you'll find these not only interesting but challenging and satisfying at the end of the day. There certainly will be challenges thrown your way, but the whole purpose of these is to get you to be thinking about how you use your paint, how you can create the illusion of certain materials and objects and so on. So this very first video in the series, we will be looking at a leaf, okay, a cabbage leaf in particular. Now, you'll see a photograph of that and so on. What I would like you to remember is, please, we're not attempting to make a photographic representation of this particular leaf. I mean, you only need to look at a cabbage leaf to know what I mean, the complexity of it. What we are doing is looking at a cabbage leaf, analyzing what it is that makes it look like a cabbage leaf or feel like a cabbage leaf, and taking that information and creating our cabbage leaf in a way that will be convincing enough to create the illusion of a surface and the material that we believe it is. So that's the idea behind it. So please don't be overawed by the image. That's the first thing. Remember too that things like color and so on, you can mix colors. I talk about this in the video, but again, don't panic if your green does not match the green of that particular photograph. What matters is it beginning to feel and look like a leaf? And that forces you to control your paint and your brush and the amount of water you use and how you pull that water around and so on. So, and it is quite an intricate little thing, but I am convinced that if you stick with this particular project and all of them, you will actually learn an awful lot more about how to control, particularly watercolor in this case, and how to look and really think about what you see. I want to teach people how to see the world and not simply to continue to just make illustrations of the world where every tree looks the same and every rock looks the same. Because there's a challenge in saying, I'm looking at that tree. That's what excites me, that tree. Otherwise, you don't need to look at trees. If you don't analyze them, then you just simply make a series of paintings of trees that, from your imagination, and they'll all be the same. So that is a particular, hobby horse of mine, and I really hope, and I do believe you'll get this from these videos. So enjoy this experience, and I look forward to seeing your photographs of the work that you've done. That's the other important thing. Of course, you're gonna have a go at this as well, and then take a photograph of the painting you've done, attach it to an email, send it to me, and then I will send you back a little video like this where I will analyze that, take it apart, and color onto it digitally, and help you maybe to make changes if changes are needed. So good luck, and just enjoy this, okay? So you'll be delighted to see that I picked an easy subject to begin with. It can look a wee bit daunting, but please don't be overwhelmed. We'll talk our way through it, and this is how we learn, you know. It's a cabbage leaf, of course, and one of the things that I wanted to do before we begin the painting of it and actually physical interpretation was just to look at the photograph for a wee second. And go through the words that we talked about earlier, the S, the T, the E, and the M, and so on. So beginning with the S, which is shape, look at this leaf and ask yourself, well, how would you describe these little shapes that we see in it? Now, they're all different sizes and so on, and different shapes, but they're all sort of fairly angular. In other words, they all have, they don't curve too much. They're quite straight edges to a lot of them. So we're aware of that. So, in your own mind, look at that and say, how would I describe those shapes? If you look at the T, which is tones, the light and shade, well, what we know is the big veins go through there are the lightest part of the whole picture, if you like. And then within the little cells, you will see within each cell, there's a little dark corner which fades out to light. And each cell has a dark fading to light because they're little bowls, little curved bowls, and the light's coming from one side. So there is a transition from dark to light there, but it's a reasonably high contrast picture. It's really quite light and shade, quite strong. So that's the tone. Look at the edges. In other words, do the edges blur together very, very softly, or do they change quite suddenly? In this picture, they're fairly sudden. Yes, in the little cells here, there's a certain blending going on. So in other words, it turns from dark to light. So we need to bleed the paint a little bit just in there. However, when we look at the veins on the outside, it's a fairly crisp, from light to dark, or light to darker, I should say. It's quite a crisp, hard line, okay? Then marks, what sort of marks do we see? Is it covered in texture, like rusty textures or rough texture? It's not really, because the texture is created by those little cells that we're going to paint. So it's not like on these veins, for instance, that they're covered with a powdery substance or flakes or things like that. They're quite smooth, really, you know. So that's what we're seeing. And by doing this, going through that process, what we do, pardon me, is get familiar with our subject before we begin to paint it. So what I would urge you to do is look at this photograph and analyze it in the way we've done, and now we'll begin to think about how we actually paint it. What I want to do here is just talk about how we see things and how we interpret things. So what I mean by that is that very often painters and artists, we tend to make assumptions that we know what a tree looks like, we know what a bit of grass looks like, and we just throw the paint on as some sort of impression of that. Now, in itself, there's nothing really wrong with that. But if you really want to understand painting and making art and so on, you need to get below the surface of that. So the question is, what is it that makes us know, for instance, that something is a rock as opposed to a piece of glass, or something is a leaf rather than a piece of fabric? And the thing is, it's because of what we see and what our eyes send the signals to our brain and so on. So what I've done is try to break this down and think about it. And we could probably categorize most things into the same sort of areas. What I mean is, for instance, shape. When we see the shape of things, our brain gets a clue that that's a tree or that's a whatever. We also understand tone. When we look at things, are they dark and light? Are they very, very strong dark or light? Are they just very delicate darks and lights? And that gives us a clue about what that material might be made of, or that thing might be made of. The third thing are the edges. What I mean, the shapes that we see, are they rugged, jaggy shapes, or are they curved, soft shapes, or something else? So that's another important thing. And then finally, we could say, well, what about the marks that we see, the textures, the scratches, and the surface textures created by certain marks on that material that tell us it's a piece of glass, or it's a piece of granite or something like that. So I've thought about this, and so we get STEM as it happens. So think about that word STEM as a way to remember this. So, you know, these are important sort of factors. And what I'm going to do now is try to interpret that, as it were, on this piece of paper, or at least give you an example of what I mean. What I'm doing here is I've just made up a neutral color. I'm not using color. Color actually, of course, is another element that gives us clues about things. But without color, we can see things. Color sometimes gets a lot of credit, as they say. So I'm focusing on the things that I've just spoken about. What I've done is made up an umber, and I think it's a Prussian blue, basically to make a very neutral sort of a grey colour. So I'm not getting involved with colour just right this second. What I'm going to do first is take a little bit of paint and think about those things I've just said. So if I was thinking about shape and thinking, okay, you know, I'm going to make geometric shapes here. So I'm going to occupy that space. I'm just drawing straight with a brush here. I'm not drawing with a pencil at this point in time because I think the brush marks will stand out better, as it were, on the video. So I'm just making a series of shapes, fairly random shapes. I'm not planning it very much, but they're geometric, as you can see. In other words, they've got hard, crisp edges. So I'm going to do that, and it could go on for quite a while. But we'll stay with that. For instance, I've painted one in, but I'm going to occupy more. What I want is there for the tone. In other words, what I've started with here, I've decided that the shapes are going to be geometric, hard lines, angular. Come to the T, which is tone. What I want in this case, I'll make the tone a very high contrast, a very strong extremes of tone. So what I'm going to do is bring in some quite strong tones even into this first one here. So I'm going to actually maybe deepen that a little bit more. So I'm just going to say, let's have extreme dark and light, as it were. So this one will be really dark. We'll let that dry. And while we are letting that dry, we'll maybe go down here and occupy this one. So this is, again, you can see a dark area with this deep tone. I'm keeping them away from each other so they won't bleed too quickly or at all, really. What I'm going to do now is maybe make one more quite dark one, let's say over here. Okay, so these are similar in tone but all very strong. And the E, as we're talking now, is edges, the edges, you know. So the E of edges, obviously the edges in this case are going to be very strong, crisp edges. They're not bleeding together, if you like. I'm going to try to put in a lighter tone into this little box here, you know, and hope that it doesn't bleed too much, okay? And maybe something a little bit stronger in over here, let's say down at the bottom here. And hopefully even now you begin to see the sort of thing I mean here, but let's get a wee intermediate tone maybe somewhere. In other words, something that's neither really strong or really pale, and put it in here, let's say. Okay, so I'm literally coloring in at the minute, and in a way this is the slightly easier one of the examples that I'm going to give you. And here, let's see if we can get something again a little bit darker, but not as dark as those first ones I put in. So what I'm doing is I've got quite an extreme thing going on. The darks are really dark, and they're quite strong in contrast to the lighter tones. This is maybe the one I'm doing now is maybe the only one that's sort of halfway between, really. But when we, as I say, I'm hoping I'm not going to bleed these, so I'm being very cautious. But when you look at this, what I hope you begin to see is a sense of something structured. It could be a rock, it could be a piece of a box or something, but it's something that's obviously, if you imagined you could touch this, you would feel something very rugged and very hard and so on. And that simply is because the brain is telling you that the shapes are hard, crisp, angular. The tones are very high contrast, very dark, very light, side by side. The edges are crisp, although they're beginning to bleed a little bit because I'm working so quickly here. But the edges are crisp. They're not bleeding together. They're not blended together. And the marks, there are no marks in the sense there's no texture on it. They're fairly flat. So all of that tells our brain, gives enough information for us to decide this is something that if we could touch it, we could imagine how it feels. So what I want to do now is just simply change those elements, change those factors if you like. So what I'm going to do is with a very, very light, watery paint, change the shape, okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to map out some curvy shapes. Hopefully you can just about see that. I don't want it to be too dark, but you know, you can see that one shape beside another, another beside another here. I'm just, you know, almost flower type shapes, but I haven't consciously made that. And then this time what I'm going to do is make them more delicate. So there's not going to be such as an extreme tone. So I'm filling this one in. And I'm going to fill maybe this one in slightly darker maybe, but not too much. What you notice is I'm putting, you know, you might notice already, I'm putting a reasonable amount of water in amongst these because I want to change something else in a minute. So the shape, the S, is now an organic, very, very soft shape. The tone is very similar. It's a low contrast. The edges in a moment are going to bleed together. So what I'm going to do here is take and actually allow the edges to soften together in these. So I'm taking the water and deliberately bleeding these edges together. So I've created soft, rounded shapes which are bleeding and don't have the same hard edges that the one beside it has. I'm going to put a little bit of darker tone in there just to see that if I put that in down at the bottom of that shape and then very gently just tease that up a little bit so you can see there's something different going on. We'll maybe just take for the sake of explanation, darken that edge as well. But instead of leaving it hard like these, you can see I'm using the water to pull it around. So all of the original shapes, in a sense, have pretty much merged together. And if I wished, I could actually dilute the edges and soften the edges. So the edges aren't straight lines. I could then make the edges broken. So I'm just doing that around the edge here, just lots of tapping with my brush, just tapping along the edges to create that. And I don't know, you know, this isn't a particular object. I don't know, it could be lots of things. But what we've done is change that STEM thing. And if you look at this and look at this could be potentially, let's say, a piece of fabric or some other surface. In other words, if you could reach out and touch that, you would get a sense of the material that it might be or could be. And if you moved over to this and rubbed your hand around that, you would get a different experience of the material. So manipulating the paint to create different materials will create the illusion, and it is all an illusion, you know. Just as a matter of interest, I've got to the M, which is the marks, because in this one, the word really marks, it's all flat. While this is damp, I could actually say, okay, well, I want to make this into a piece of fabric or piece of cotton wool or something which is nearly organic. And look at the marks that I'm making here. So, well, let's change the type of mark. Instead of a smooth, even mark, I'm stabbing it with the brush all the way around the edges here. I'm going to bleed these together again. In other words, I'm going to change the edges. So when we talk about edges, we can't really mean blending. Are they hard edges where they're not blended? Are they soft where they are blended? So now I'm just drying the brush slightly here, and with a pretty dry brush, because there's a lot of water already on that, if I keep tapping and squiggling and tapping and moving quickly with the point of the brush, you could change different brushes. Different brushes square brush will make a different pattern. But if I do that, and especially if I allow this to keep on bleeding, it'll become really quite nice and soft. So now we have created another material. Could be a piece of moss, but in other words, this is where it begins. It begins with not looking at things and saying it's a piece of moss or it's a tree or whatever. As an artist, you're trying to say, what am I seeing in the visual language? I'm seeing dark and light. I'm seeing hard edges. No, I'm seeing soft edges. I'm seeing geometric shapes. I'm seeing organic, natural shapes. I'm seeing no bleeding, or seeing lots of bleeding. I'm seeing no marks or a few marks. I'm seeing lots of marks. And so that's what you look for. You try to avoid using the name of the thing. It's very, very difficult. But when we look at the world, and say, we're giving the things names: apple, orange, tree, whatever. But as the artist, you speak a different language. And therefore, these are the things you should be looking for to create these different materials. So this series of videos and exercises will talk us through, hopefully, 5 different approaches to materials. And what you can do then is produce your own, try these things out, send the photographs to me, and I will be able to talk to you and give you some feedback and opinion about what you've done and how you could do it and so on. So hopefully that's a useful introduction to what we're just about to do. So what I have here is a sheet of paper which I've actually tinted very, very slightly. I'm not sure, hopefully you can see, but it's a palest of yellowish green. It's a cadmium yellow, tiny little bit of ultramarine blue in there, and washed over this paper very, very lightly indeed, simply just to give it that warmth that is in the leaf itself. As I say, don't please be overly anxious about matching colors at this point in time. What we're trying to do, as I said before, is create some illusion of the sense of material that we have here, okay, the fabric, if you like, of the objects. So we had a look at this photograph earlier, and we looked through the business of how we see the shapes and how we look at the edges and the tones and so on. So try to keep that in mind. What I'm going to do, I'm drawing here with a pencil. Sometimes I would work with watercolor straight directly, but in order to illustrate this, I'm using a pencil. I'm using a darker pencil than I would normally anyway. So what I'm going to do is begin to just construct some of these shapes. We're not obviously going to paint the entire piece of leaf. What we're trying to do is capture the sense of all of the things that we looked at with regards to those words. So I'm beginning to look at a section here, and honestly, please do not be concerned that we're matching this accurately either. What we're trying to do is follow the sense of the fact that, okay, we have angular shapes and we have certain tones and things like that. So I'm creating lots of little cells here, with light lines. All right, so I'm not following this totally accurately, as you can imagine, but I just want to show you how that it would all eventually construct. So you can see what I'm doing. Hopefully some of these shapes are different to others, and some of the cells are bigger and so on, and make that one different shape there. So creating little veins and things there. Some of them are smaller than others, and some of them are quite big. And then we have another piece coming out here, So what I'm doing here is saying, okay, I have these angular sort of shapes, but they're not, they're all irregular. They're not the same at all. And you can continue to do this for as long as you want, really, you know. So what I'm doing is creating a couple of large veins coming out there and then letting the rest sort of happen. So as I say, I'm not following exactly what I see in the photograph, simply because I've decided, well, what I know is it's irregular shapes. So we'll start drawing irregular shapes that represent what I'm seeing in the photograph. And it's worth doing this because it is about watching something develop. You know, we're beginning to see now, for instance, something it's looking like a spider web almost. And hopefully when the paint goes on, it will start to make more sense. But I'm filling in lots of things here. We'll have one over there. Let that branch off there like that. And it becomes quite therapeutic in a strange way. Have that one going off that way and that one linking up with that and so on. And I'm probably drawing these a little bit larger as well for the purpose of this exercise. Okay. We'll bring one over here and so on. So we're getting quite a lot. What I would like to do is try to imagine, we'll take that big main vein up there, and what I'm trying to imagine here, think about, is the edge, the actual edge of the leaf. Remember we talked about marks and edges. Well, look, it's this crinkly sort of quality. So let's just go ahead and actually do that. See the little crinkly line, because that's another characteristic of the leaf that tells us it would feel the way it would feel if we could touch it. So these little veins, we can bring them on out to the edge here, and they come in and get very thin at the end anyway, so we don't need to necessarily overstate this. Okay, so we can let the paint kind of fade away when we come to the edges of that. So we're creating a structure is really what we're doing, that tells us something about the nature of this object that we're looking at. So you can see there, we're saying, right, one of the characteristics of this leaf was geometric, irregular, cellular shapes. And that's exactly what I've attempted to produce here. I'm going to put another couple in there. Probably enjoying this far too much. But you can see the nature of what's going on. I'm going to carry one out here actually as well, just as an extra. So we now have a structure framework of shapes. Okay, so what we're going to look at now is tone. Have a look at the tones. We agreed when we looked at the photograph earlier that the tone involves light veins, but in each cell, within the cells, as it were, we had a dark going out to light graduation, and that was the characteristic of this object. So that's the next thing. We're going to start to occupy these cells and so on, and try to get that blend to the right degree to give a sense that each one of them is, as it were, a little bowl, a little dip. Now, one of the things that we notice about the tonal variation in this leaf is that the brightest part or parts are the main large veins and a few on the way out, but in the between those main large veins where you have the small bits of little cells, those little veins aren't as bright. So the brightest parts are these big thick veins, and the rest are quite slightly deeper than that. So what I'm gonna do, and I'm hopefully you can see just there, you see that little bit of paint there. That is a very pale sort of green made up with lemon and ultramarine. And what I'm gonna do is occupy the areas inside these little areas here, leaving alone the big veins, if that makes sense. So those biggest of veins, I'm gonna leave those. So I'm choosing some of the blocks in here and just beginning to occupy certain bits. Okay, so that's a largey sort of vein there, so I'll leave those lighter, I should say. And over here, also this little area here. So everything in those areas will be generally that little bit darker than the main veins. And we'll let that dry. It'll be even easier to see once it's dry, but we can see that what we're doing here is leaving some of these thick areas light, I should say, and they will represent, as it were, the main veins, and then we'll work into the other areas as we go. So I'm taking that right out here and maybe out to the edge as well, because the colors do sort of merge a bit as we come to the edge. And basically what I'm trying to do is try to match things that I see. I'm not when I say match, I'm not reproducing this leaf exactly as we know. But what I'm trying to do is, if I notice something, then I'm trying to include it. I'm saying, well, actually it's interesting because those big light main veins are lighter and the rest are slightly darker. So let's do that. So what we've done, or what we are doing, is just beginning to make a bit of a difference to the tone. We're using green because it's a green object, but the main thing really is dark and light. So what you're seeing here is the bits that I'm leaving alone to remain as the real light veins, and the other bits that I'm deepening slightly for later on. So I can't stress this enough, that these exercises, and indeed working with paint in general, learning about paint is not to do with producing the pictures. It's to do with the process that goes on whilst you do that. What I want to do now is occupy these spaces. These spaces have just washed down with this pale green, with lots or more little cellular shapes with my paintbrush. And what I'm going to do on this little blank area is just explain what I mean. What I want to do now is a slightly deeper green, and all I'm going to do is take and create, just dab my wee bit of paint off there, create some little shapes you can see just with a brush. So I'm just going to go through it, these little different angular cellular shapes. So that's basically what I'm going to do within these areas, maybe on a smaller scale, but just simple little geometrics, hard edge or more hard edge little shapes. I'm not putting a lot of variety of tone in it right now. We're going to do that afterwards. So I'm going to begin that process, which will take a wee bit of time, but we'll just work through little patches there. Put one in, maybe leave a patch, so to allow that other area to dry. A little bit there, maybe a little bit in here. Then move into this little area, little patch there, and so on. So, just using your own instinct to decide what shapes are, they can be they should be all different, or at least varied. So you can see bit by bit. I'm going in, and I say I'm trying to keep them apart to avoid bleeding. But you know, there's bound to be a certain degree of bleeding there. But what we're doing is getting a feel for the smaller detail now. It's beginning to happen. And it's worth pushing this, taking the time and the patience to just put these wee patches in. They don't need to be absolutely straight edge. In fact, it might work as well just to have a wee bit of more character to them in the sense that they're not looking like mathematical shapes. And it's very easy to fall into that. But, you know, just triangles, hexagons, squares, whatever. Pardon me. As long as they're varied, okay. So, and take as long as at this as you wish. And it is worth actually trying to occupy most of this area here, okay. So work your way through that, creating these little sort of shapes patched into these empty areas. You can see now as we put these in that the light of the veins is a bit more obvious as well. Now we have the painting at this stage whereby you can see what I did earlier. I occupied these main areas with lots of small little patches of this slightly deeper green. And you'll get variations of green depending on how you're mixing your paints together. So that gives a nice effect to begin with. Now, what we notice are a couple of things. One is that obviously the edges along here where these cells meet the main veins are a little bit irregular here and there because of what I've been doing with these patches. So we want to try and tidy those up as we go along. The other thing is, as we came to the outside edge of the leaf, I wanted to leave that deliberately, because what happens is that it tends to become wishy-washy or paler as we go out. So I'm actually putting on a pale green as we get the outside. However, what I noticed also was that when we get to the edge, there are little deeper patches going on where the leaf is curled in on itself, the light and shade. So you can see there, here and there, I'm putting a little bit deeper tone, and here and there I'm leaving it because that would maybe represent the lighter bits. So you see that we have a little bit of crinkliness there, and you can even fade those in slightly, which can be nicer too. So in other words, while they're wet, just give that a little rub so that they don't look completely like a line. That makes sense. So we have this nice feeling of the edge of the leaf going on, and it gives us a definition to the edge of it as well. So now we're going to create that graduation of tone that I talked about earlier on, where we talked about each cell having a dark corner where the shadow was, fading across to light. And if I just gently push this up, so you can see this is a giant version, if you like, of that situation. So imagine those as being a couple of those little cells. What I mean by that is taking a dark tone, and let's say we decide that the shadow is on the right, towards the right side in the top. So in other words here, so we're going to put a little bit of paint in there to represent shadow. We're going to rinse the brush, and just with a damp brush, we're going to bleed that, encourage it across towards the other side. And of course, as we encourage it, and as we just dab in a slight amount of clean water, you'll see that fading so that it goes gradually from one side to the other. I'm going to do the same here. Let's go for the top right corner with a darker tone. Rinse the brush, just a slightly damp brush, and just gently tease along the edges and pull the color across. So we're creating that gradation, and it might continue to bleed for a little bit of time, which is probably okay anyway. So you can manipulate the paint, but as long as we are creating that fade from dark to light from one side to another, then we begin to create a greater sense of depth. So I'm bringing this back down into the side again. What I've done is actually make up a green with lemon yellow, ultramarine blue, and a tiny little bit of crimson in there. And because crimson or red is complementary of green, you see if I bring over my little scrap of paper here, you can see that you get a really deep, earthy sort of a green, which will give us the shadow, hopefully. So what I'll begin to do, and this is quite a fine brush, you can see here, you know, if you look at the size of my hand, that's my ring or whatever, that's sort of size we're dealing with. But if I begin dropping in a couple of little spots, say there, then rinse the brush while they're all still slightly damp, and just tap around the edges of what I've just done, tap the edge, and you can see I'm encouraging that to bleed and soften a little bit. I'll go back to my colour, maybe put another little bit in here on that side, a little bit on that side, and when I get up to the white line or the light line, it gives me a chance to tidy that up using this paint. Then rinse the brush, wipe it slightly, damp brush, tap it, and if you think you've too much water, then just dab the brush with a little tissue or a rag just to soften that. We don't want black spots. We want it to look as if it belongs to the rest of the leaf. And we can see there's one there. Let's do 2 or 3. Maybe one in there, one in there, one in there. All in the same sort of corners. And again, just with a barely damp brush, just soften and soften. Bleed that across very slightly. And so on. And repeat this process. You can keep this process going until you occupy most of these spaces. And I'm going to do that and come back to it. But even I hope at this stage you can see the beginnings of this feeling like there's some indentations beginning to happen in the leaf itself. So here we are, having occupied a lot more of these cells with these little dark corners that I mentioned. So in other words, a little darker tone in the top corners of each one of them, and trying to bleed them across. So now what we've got are shapes in here which have a dark bit and a light bit. So there's a fade between one tone and another. They're not just all the same tone. In other words, if you look over here, this is what they looked like earlier. These little simple flat shapes. Now if you look, you'll see variations in tone within each. Now what is interesting is what this does is throws up the whole business of balance of tone. As I darken these inner bits, it appeared to make the veins, the big veins, much lighter, obviously, because in comparison to the dark that I was putting in, these start to look even lighter, and therefore maybe not quite as natural as we would want it. It looks as if that's leaping up far too far above the rest. So what I'm going to do is just take a flat brush here, and on my flat brush I have a very dilute, you can see a green there, and I'm going to wash across most of this. So this is pretty dry, but I'm very quickly just going to put a wash over what was white looking. And what this will do, it'll pull things together a bit more. You'll still have variation in tone, but it tends to just push the unifies. I think that's the word I'm looking for. It tends to pull and the colors together, and you don't have that shock of those white strips or stripes that we had a moment ago. Now I'm going to let this dry, because there is obviously some reflection going on in the water, and we'll have a look at that once it's dry. You can see now the difference it has made as I've washed across. the previous work, and you can see that what's happened is the washes have pushed back the extreme contrast, and there aren't so many highlights, if you like. But it has also lifted away little bits of the paint that I'd put on previously, and in some ways actually has helped create quite a nice sort of natural crinkliness within this illusion of the leaf, you know. And this is another thing it's worth keeping in mind, that sometimes we try something and it results in something that's useful. So keep that. We do have now an image that can suggest a cabbage leaf, I believe. There are things that it might be quite nice to push on with, though. One of those things is obviously that we've lost a little bit of the lightness of some of the veins because I've washed over it. So we can try and find a way to actually revamp those, if you like. And the other thing is, there's part of me quite interested now in seeing if I can place some smaller cells in here to make, you know, a lot more busier areas. And in a way, it's sort of a you know, a personal thing, just a curiosity. But with regards to the first issue, the light, we can perhaps, if I take this is again a very small brush with a little water on it, I could lay that on that line you can see there and push away from myself. Now you can, you know, people use cotton buds and things to do this, but we can't do that. And with a little bit of water on the brush, I'm rubbing that. Now I'm drying the brush and then using the brush as a mop to remove a little bit of that. And you can see the light reappearing. Again, it depends on the paper you're using. This paper is sort of average quality. It's not the world's best, but it's okay. Again, rubbing around a bit further down the line here, pushing the brush away from itself, you know, forcing the point of the brush forward and back, and then removing the water, and then with a dry brush, very gently going over that. And you can begin to lift out little bits of light to retrieve that. And again, as I say, depending on the quality of the paper, this will work. Sometimes if the paper is like this sort of average, it will eventually maybe disintegrate a bit. So, you know, the better the quality paper, the more it can take this sort of approach. But you can see how I'm beginning to get a wee bit of life back into those veins that I had previously washed over. So even with watercolor, it is possible to retrieve things for quite a while. I'm rubbing a little bit more, drying the brush, laying the brush on, slowly moving it as it mops away the water, and we're lifting that up. So that's one way to create the light out of that. And the other thing I spoke about was possibly going back to, I'm just, the noise you're hearing is me rubbing some darker paint. That was the lemon with a little bit of ultramarine and the tiniest bit of crimson red in there to desaturate it. So I have quite a deep color. So what I can do as a little experiment is go into these little cells that we painted earlier and try to break up further cells or create further cells. So using our little dark areas here, I can create a few more dark sections and different directions here. So for each of those cells, I'm putting 2 or 3 of these little spots in there. Then give the brush a little rinse, a slight wipe, so it's a damp brush here. And again, just beside those dark bits, I'm tapping them to encourage them to bleed a little bit, so they blend in along with the rest. So I'm breaking these up into little patches, but leaving the odd, or leaving a few light bits. In other words, I'm not just filling in, I don't want to just fill in these big cells with a darker version of themselves. So you can see that there are several spots in each cell now. So 1, 2, in that little sort of triangular shape, I'm putting 3 darker dots. Over here, maybe I'll put 1 there, 1 here, 1 there, maybe a bit different sizes and shapes. That's the thing, to try and keep a sense of it being natural and therefore not all perfectly geometric, and just dots or just blocks of color. And you can begin to see, I hope, this becoming busier and more crinkly. And it is quite an interesting sort of little exercise to watch. And it is intricate, and I know some of you may have a painting style that is not necessarily as intricate as this, but what we're doing today is learning about the language of paint and how we can control it in different ways. And the more words we have in our language, the better we become at speaking the art language, if you like. So it takes a bit of time, just dot, dot. Don't, as I say, be careful not to fall into a rhythm of just the spots looking the same. And you can see this whole section now, compared to the rest, looking more intense and more crinkly. And what I'll do is I'll just try to create a wee bit more interest around the edge here. So I'm not, as you can see, I'm not following absolutely by any means the original photograph we're looking at. What I'm doing is being inspired by it, by having analysed it to say what makes it look cabbagey. And then when I get that, I'm applying it to my image. So there you can see a little rugged edge going on as well. And this bit is becoming quite lively, especially with the addition of that green, because it's a slightly more bluish green. And it's quite nice because it gives another cooler dimension amongst everything else. And I'm trying to maintain the little veins there as well, so we won't lose those completely, until that whole section now is beginning to come together in an interesting little way. So we're getting something that is looking like a cabbage leaf. We could continue to work on this for as long as you want, although there comes a time when we inevitably overdo things, as most of you or many of you know. But we're beginning to get a great illusion, a nice illusion here of that surface quality, the material. In other words, if we could reach out and touch that, we're getting some feeling of what the touch of that would be like. And what I would like you to do now is view this video, maybe again, not just this once, but view it again, follow these steps, break down that STEM idea. What shapes did you see? What tones did you see? How were the edges? Were the edges hard or soft or bled together or crisp or whatever? And what sort of marks did you make, or do we need to make? I should more accurately say. And if you keep asking those questions, you'll begin to get the illusions to work for you. And it is a very satisfying sort of situation or experience, but it takes patience, it takes effort, and including some disappointments, but you will begin to see how you can control paint. So this is going to be your homework. And once you do that, I would like you to send me the results, and I will get back to you with a little feedback video and give you some advice if I need to. What I'm doing here, just as I'm speaking, this brush has just got slightly small amount of water, and I'm just going over. You see that tapping? I'm tapping it, tap. I'm not stroking it with clean water. The reason is I'm just generally softening in those little dots that I've just been putting on, so that they merge with everything else, and try to make everything belong to this one leaf. We don't want it to look like a leaf that has green spots on top of it. We want it to look like a leaf whereby the green spots belong in it, if that makes sense. Anyway, I'm getting carried away because I'm enjoying doing this. I will stop there, and I hope to see the results of your own work.